Hello everyone. First of all, I want to give you an apology. I've made this secondary channel with great intentions of making videos looking at stuff other than my British and British Commonwealth collection, some of the other bits and pieces in my collection from other countries, and things have just gone on top of me a little bit recently, and hopefully come January there'll be a little bit more time once exams are out of the way, and I'll be able to keep a couple of videos coming out each month, something like that, which is what I'd initially intended. So a much delayed upload today, looking at the kit of, or a recreation of the kit of a Bren Gunner in the Royal Netherlands Army in the early 1960s. Now, this is an interesting time period. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, there was a modernisation of the forces of the Royal Netherlands Army. First of all, you see the introduction of combat dress in the very late 1950s to replace battle dress, and then a move away from Second World War surplus weaponry to more modern weapons, and we're in that transitional period with the newer combat uniform, the combat uniform having been introduced but still using the older weaponry. So we have the Bren gun as an example of that here. So without further ado, we'll get into the main part of the video and have a look at this recreation. Looking at an overview of the recreation here, you can see the aesthetic which would mark out Dutch soldiers for much of the rest of the Cold War from the 1960s onwards. The kit and equipment you see here, the combat uniform, was little changed by the end of the Cold War, and many of the components seen here will be issued right the way through to the end. We'll talk about the weapon carried briefly to start off with. This is a Bren light machine gun, of course, as already mentioned, and this particular example is a 1942 Inglis-made example, so a Canadian Bren gun. This is a Mark I fitted with a Mark II barrel. In Dutch service, the Bren was being phased out of use with the regulars around this time. It was being replaced by the FN MAG, the FN MAG. However, the Bren would go on to be used by the reserves through to the end of the 1980s, so it had a very long service life with the Dutch forces. You can see that a sling is fitted, and this is a specific Bren sling. It's a lengthened version of the Mills webbing sling, which had been in use by the British for many years as a rifle sling, and it's been fitted at each end with a clip which allows it to be clipped onto the sling mounting points on the Bren gun, one up near the bipod at the front and one on the stock at the rear. Moving on to talk about headgear, we have here the M53 steel helmet, and you can see quite clearly from the outline here this is a clone of the US M1, and this was common amongst many continental European armies in the post-war years who opted to copy the US M1 helmet, and the Royal Netherlands Army were one of the forces who decided to adopt the M1. Manufactured locally. The design is slightly modified, but very similar indeed to the original US produced helmets. This is covered with a piece of hessian, sandbag material essentially, with a piece of netting over that, and this is held in place with a piece of inner tube cut to make a rubber band. You can see that the netting has had sections of elastic added onto it, and this of course makes it easier to attach foliage for greater camouflage in the field. We move on to talk about the combat uniform now, and this is the Dutch M58 combat uniform, which had been introduced in 1958. The uniform had both summer weight and winter weight components, and we have here the combat jacket, which is part of the colder weather clothing, and this is made of a heavy canvas. You can see at the neck a scrim scarf is worn. This hasn't been knotted around the neck, it's simply draped around the neck to give a bit of extra insulation. Underneath the combat jacket, a herringbone twill shirt would be worn, and this is very similar indeed to US fatigue uniform of the time, made in herringbone twill cotton. The trousers are the lighter weight version, and these are made of herringbone twill. There are also a version of these made of the heavier canvas, the same material used to make the combat jacket. The trousers are quite distinctive in having a bellows cargo pocket on each leg, and you can see an example of that here. These are visually distinctive in that they have a button in the very corner of the squared pocket flap, and this is a distinctive feature of both types of trousers, both the lightweight examples here and the heavier weight version as well. The web equipment is the Dutch M52, and this is based very closely on British 1937 pattern equipment. Indeed, the components are widely interchangeable. You can see at the front here we have the ammunition pouches, and these are based very closely on the British basic pouch, and therefore will easily carry 2 Bren gun magazines apiece. And the design overall is very, very similar to the British basic pouches. The way they attach to the belt, the way they're supported by the braces or suspenders, all very similar to British practice. And you can also see here the L-straps carrying the haversack on the back hook into the top of the pouches in exactly the same way as 1937 pattern equipment. One area in which the equipment differs is that the belt is modified. It basically follows 1937 pattern form in terms of the fixtures and fittings, but it also has a row of eyelets along the bottom edge, and the reason for this is to allow equipment using US M1910 type hanger hooks
to be suspended from the bottom of the belt. And an example of that can be seen here with the entrenching tool carrier. This is based on US M1943 practice. The cover is very similar and closes with a lift-the-dot fastener, as you can see here. This contains a folding shovel, very similar to the US M1943 design. It's folded up here, but when taken out of the pouch, the head can be folded out and it functions as a small shovel. Further round on the hip, we have the water bottle in its carrier, and this is an aluminium design based very closely on the US M1910 water bottle or canteen, and this has a cup nested with it as well, and it's carried in what is basically a copy of the US carrier. And this has a lift-the-dot fastener on each shoulder of the bottle. It's padded in exactly the same way and is basically indistinguishable apart from the lack of US markings. And you can also see in this shot the back of the belt, which is supported by two buckles which buckle onto the braces or suspenders in exactly the same manner as 1937 pattern. Moving up the back, we can have a look at the haversack here, and this again is basically copied from 1937 pattern practice. It is slightly modified, which we'll get to in just a moment, but the external fixtures and fittings are by and large very similar, and the internal dividers are very similar as well. And Dutch mess tins and so forth were based on a British design as well, so could easily be accommodated in the haversack in the same manner as British 1937 pattern equipment. One other thing to note here is the buttons on the back of the combat jacket just below the collar, and these allow a hood to be attached when necessary. Looking at a side profile of the haversack here, you can see one element of the design which was modified from British 1937 pattern, and that is the addition of webbing loops stitched onto the side of the haversack. There's also one up on the top of the flap of the haversack as well, and these allow straps to be fitted to allow a load to be strapped to the outside of the haversack. For example, the shelter half and a blanket rolled up inside it could be bent into a horseshoe shape and carried around the haversack strapped onto it using these loops. The final thing to talk about here is footwear, and we have a pair of Dutch M57 boots here. These are a pair of high leg combat boots made in brown leather, as you can see, a grained leather. They have a toe cap. They are quite similar to US jump boots, or indeed the russet combat boots, which had been issued in the earlier 1950s, and these are quite often used as a stand-in by, or were quite often used as a stand-in by US reenactors in place of the World War II Corcoran jump boots. So they are quite a nice pair of boots. I have to say I rather like these, just as an aside. They're a very high quality, very good design of combat boot, and they were in use for many years. Much as they were supplemented in the later 1960s by further designs, they still turn up in photographs right the way through the end of the Cold War. So just have another look at the overview of the recreation here. You can see the mix of British and US influence in the equipment and the uniform. The combat jacket in particular, however, is very distinctive in terms of its design. It's quite a distinctively Dutch garment with the design of the angled pockets on the chest and so forth. And overall, you get quite a distinctive look to the Dutch soldier, even though the equipment and the uniform and so forth is drawn from both British and US influence. That in combination, it's not hard to pick out Dutch soldiers in terms of the kit and equipment they were wearing. And as I say, what we see here, much as it is representing the kit of a Dutch soldier in the early 1960s, you nevertheless have an aesthetic shown here which would really remain relatively consistent through to the end of the Cold War, with some minor changes. That's perhaps the topic for future videos, we shall see.
So there we are. I hope you found it interesting looking at this. I certainly found it interesting putting this together. I will say once again, I'm very sorry for the delay in uploads. There will be more coming out certainly in the new year once my exams are out of the way, which is early to mid-January. There should be a few more uploads coming out then. In the meantime, I do hope you found this interesting. If you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, obviously in a few weeks' time, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And obviously, if you hit the little notification button down below, the little bell, you'll be alerted of when I do upload new videos. Hopefully this is of interest in the meantime, and do keep an eye out for those future uploads as well. Bye for now.